Hello and most welcome to Heidegger 1432 of the series. I will continue today with the inner and outer by Paul Johnston, Wittgenstein, Rethinking the Inner. And we are presently at page 16. And we've been talking earlier about calculating. And whether calculating is an inner process or whether it is an outer process. And we mentioned briefly that inside and outside are not at all possible. Instead, it is rather a matter of two completely different language games. The inner and outer might not be what we think. They do not defy closer inspection. The variety of ways in which calculating in the head might be expressed show how the phenomenon can be looked at in many different ways. Indeed, despite our obsession with inner processes, there is no reason why it has to be seen as a process at all. As Wittgenstein points out, it could easily be seen under a completely different aspect. One teaches someone to calculate in his head by ordering him to calculate. But would it have to be like that? Might it not be that in order to get him to calculate in his head, I don't have to say calculate, but rather do something else, only get the result, or shut your mouth and your eyes and keep still, and you will learn the answer. I want to say that one need not look at calculating in the head under the aspect of calculating. Although it has an essential tie-up with calculating. Nor even under the aspect of doing. For doing is something that one can give an exhibition of. I choose to repeat that because it's widely important. Failure to separate the two things will lead to, of course, mind and matter problem and other problems. I will now go to the second paragraph of page 17. To sum up, our talk of calculating in the head can be seen as having two components. First, it involves a natural extension of the concept of calculation to cover a new phenomenon versus the individual's ability to give the result of a sum without making any calculation on paper. Second, it involves a new use of the terminology of calculation versus the individual's use of it to express her experience. In pointing this out, Wittgenstein is not seeking to deny that we calculate in our heads. His aim is simply to undermine the idea that what lies behind this concept is some mysterious mental process which somehow corresponds to calculation on paper. Well, I said I won't do anything when it comes to drawing, but this I will do actually. Put that to the summary. Similarly, in the case of inner speech, the thrust of this argument is to undermine the tendency to treat the outer as the model for the inner. The difficulty is that the existence of certain connections encourage us to treat the inner as a hidden version of the outer. In fact, however, quote, one cannot say writing in one's notebook or speaking is like silent thinking, but for certain purposes, the one process can replace the other. That is, calculating in the head can replace calculating on paper. The force of Wittgenstein's remarks is not to reject the idea of inner experience, but to undermine an incoherent account of the nature of that experience. This is widely explosive stuff. The force of Wittgenstein's remarks is not to reject the idea of inner experience, but to undermine an incoherent account of the nature of this experience. His aim is to question the approach we are naturally inclined to take, and to guide us towards a new way of seeing these phenomena and the concepts they involve. as Wittgenstein himself notes. If someone were now to say, so after all that happens is that he reacts, behaves in such and such a way, then this would once again be a gross misunderstanding. For if someone gave the account, I, in some sense, calculated the result of the multiplication without writing, etc. Did he talk nonsense or make a false report? It is a different employment of language from that of a description of behavior. But one might indeed ask, wherein resides the importance of this new employment of language? Wherein resides the importance, that is, of expression of intention? The locus classicus for Wittgenstein's attack on the traditional conception of the inner is, of course, the private language argument. However, the idea that these remarks are a self-contained whole is somewhat misleading, as is the suggestion that the main concern is with the nature of language. As our discussion on calculating in the head has illustrated, the importance of Wittgenstein's remarks on privacy is that they point to the need for a complete reassessment of our conception of the inner. For this reason, the private language conception of the inner, the private language argument cannot be isolated from the rest of Wittgenstein's work. Indeed, it might well be said to raise more questions than it answers. The arguments which undermine the idea of privacy should be viewed not as the completion of a philosophical task, but as its delineation. Although they contain the seeds of a positive account, they also raise a vast array of new problems which the rest of the philosophical investigations and Wittgenstein's other writings are devoted to solving. In the private language remarks, Wittgenstein focuses on the example of sensations, and he considers the idea of a language whose words refer to what can only be known to the person speaking. To his immediate private sensations. Ex hypothesis, such a language would be incomprehensible to anyone other than its creator, for no one else could know what its words refer to. Clearly, this clashes with the fact that we do talk about our sensations. Leaving this point to one side, however, Wittgenstein spells out in more detail what a private language would have to involve. The sensation words in it would be defined by the individual forging a private link between the name and the sensation. For example, if she wanted to keep a diary about the recurrence of certain sensations, she would do this by associating the sensation with the sign S and writing the sign down on every occasion on which the sensation occurred. This procedure differs from normal ostensive definition in that the individual would not be able to point to what she is defining, since the sensation is, of course, private. Instead, she is assumed to point, as it were, mentally, forging the link between sign and its referent by concentrating her attention on the sensation she is trying to name. In this way, the private linguist impresses upon herself the connection between the sign and the sensation. Although for everyone else the sign is meaningless, for her it has meaning. As this sketch makes clear, the private language case rests on the possibility of a private ostensive definition. That is how you point within yourself. According to Wittgenstein, however, this involves a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of ostensive definition. One way of illustrating this point is to note the ambiguity in the idea of giving something a name. Typically, when we talk of giving something a name, what is involved is naming a predefined object. That is, naming a ship or giving a name to a child. With ostensive definition, however, what is at stake is something quite different. Not the naming of a predefined object, but the definition of a concept. A distinction the Venerable Augustine could not make. For this reason, pointing is not enough. Instead, rules for the use of the concept must be laid down, for it is only by specifying what it is to count at the same thing that the nature of what being pointed to is determined. So it's not enough to use your finger to point to a concept. It needs to be used. The rules needs to be there. If someone points to an object and says, "That is X," this might be the definition of a color, a quantity, or an entirely new concept. Only when the person explains how we should use this sample, in what way other objects should be compared with it, and adjudged the same, is a particular concept actually defined, not before. Thus, giving a name to something is the culmination of the defining process. The person giving the definition points to a sample, but this act only defines a word if the rules for using the sample are clear. This point, however, is completely ignored by a private linguist who treats defining as if it were simply a questioning of naming. My comment there, this is how we get the empty concepts, non-working concepts that are laughed at from outside the educational system today. What she forgets is that a great deal of stage setting in the language is presupposed if the mere act of naming is to make sense. In this sense, her fundamental error is to believe that once you know what the word stands for, you understand it, you know its whole use. And that is this oversimplification by the philosophers. And in the case of philosophical investigations, it is particular poor old Augustine that is pointed out as one of those who made that mistake. Well, he's not alone. But he thinks it would be enough to teach a child by pointing to a concept like imbibing or enjoying, like this, or wanting to have a cup of coffee to quench one's thirst rather than drink something stimulating by pointing. That assumes language, all of language, years and years of learning, and an historical process of millennia or tens of thousands of years. Thus, the first stage of Wittgenstein's argument is to stress that an ostensive definition only makes sense where there are rules for using the sample it introduces, and hence where there is a practice of using that sample. In the case of the private linguists, however, there are neither rules nor a practice. The private linguist supposedly undertakes to use the word in a particular way. But she does not specify what that way consists of. I can compare my own commentaries like saying somebody asks, where is the way to the mayor's office? And you just say, there is a way. Or go there, something like that, without explaining anything. That would never work. The private linguist supposedly undertakes to use the word in a particular way, but she doesn't specify what that way consists of. It is to be assumed that she invents the technique of using the word, or does she find it ready-made? The real problem, however, is not simply that she fails to lay down rules, but that in principle she could not do so. This is because the concept of a rule only makes sense where there is a practice of following the rule. And a practice is necessarily public, something which more than one person might in principle engage in. Contingently, there may be only one person in the practice, and its rules may be known to her alone. But unless others can in principle learn the rules, there is no basis for saying that the individual is following a rule, rather than just doing what seems right to her at the time. The point is that without publicly checkable procedures, she cannot distinguish between following the rule and merely thinking she is following the rule. Since this is so, all her supposed private rule following can amount to is doing whatever seems right to her at the time. By contrast, where we can properly speak of rule following, there are established ways of determining whether or not something is in accordance with the rule. These procedures create the logical scope for distinguishing between the individual thinking she is following the rule and her actually doing so. For the private linguists, no such distinction is possible, so that whatever mental feats she may perform, would-be ostensive definitions cannot fulfill their function. As Wittgenstein puts it in his lectures, listen up. Nothing I can do in myself can make it a rule. Perhaps if I concentrated my attention, I'd sooner learn some sort of rule. But if it were a public rule, it would have to be public. Being a rule means being an instrument that is checkable and by agreed technique. Put a little pause here. Let's see. So I will do my summary here. Now I focus on one quote on the whiteboard. But I will first once more point to what Paul Johnston is extra careful in pointing out. He doesn't undermine the inner, but rather the idea that the inner process is a different process altogether. Second, it involves a new use of the terminology of calculation versus the individual's use of it to express her experience. In pointing this out, Wittgenstein is not seeking to deny that we calculate in our heads. His aim is simply to undermine the idea that what lies behind this concept is some mysterious mental process, which somehow, listen now, corresponds to calculation on paper. Corresponds to could be replaced with represents. So we see the whole thing starts here with this. It's not a mistake in the common sense, but representation and the res cogitans. When you have the res cogitans, you have matter, res extensa. So this first thinking mistake gives so much else, and it gives in the end reductionism. The idea that there is nothing in the world with any value whatsoever. Not concepts, nor the world, nor us. And this is building on a huge, maybe the biggest mistake ever. And poor venerable Augustine has to be the straw man for that mistake. Of course, it was not invented by him. What Wittgenstein means by bringing venerable Augustine into it is to have a straw man. It could be anyone. The totality of thinking history has also committed the same mistake. But it becomes extra clear as he extends it that a point of a finger would be enough to learn a non-verbal child what a concept means, like a book or a pen. Ignoring that a book could be something you sit on, burn, eat, use as sustenance, use as a cover, millions of uses. And this is so clearly explained here in the critique of the private linguist. And this is clear, sharp, and not too long. What she forgets is that a great deal of stage setting in language is presupposed if the mere act of naming is to make sense. So even the ostensive function that Augustine thought was simple takes, and I would say take millions of years to develop. It takes the whole world with all the doings in that world. And I say maybe it took 50,000 years to develop it. And now we have come only to the finger pointing. We haven't got into what it means to understand what a book is. This mistake is similar of scope as pointing to a book to a non-verbal, non-literal child and say, there, writing. And after that pointing, the child can write and read. It's the same magnitude of mistake. The reason we do this, according to Wittgenstein, is that we are used to it. We're used to swallowing a horde of elephants and then be very careful with specific things. Poor old Augustine. What he exposed was to be atheism in the end. That's the idea. Once we have empty mental processes, res cogitans, the feature of having no extension or having no meaning is transferred to matter. And then all of a sudden, all of the universe is senseless, meaningless. Just as every concept would be that are pointed out only, and not done, experienced, realized in time. Paul Johnston is good because you need to be clear here that Wittgenstein is not criticizing the inner nor the outer. And I will refrain here to make two circles, one that shows the inner and one that shows the outer, because it would reinforce the idea that those things are things. There is of course an inner, but it is an inner of doings, of those 50,000 years and billions of doings. It's a bit more to inner than a circle I point to and say, that's inner. Or if I point to myself, this is my soul. Can you see here how ignorance is sleeping in, seeping slowly in and eroding the concept? Yes, I think an expression like empty concept is plaguing us today. But it's a bit more to it than that. Not all concepts are empty today. Otherwise, Armageddon would already be here. But some are, and some of those concepts are incredibly important to us, or should be. Like our immortal soul, or the divine, or the spiritual. There are many things there, and yet more, like understanding that becomes impossible if taken that the concept can be pointed out. This can be compared to defining a concept, sort of pointing where it isn't or where it is, and sort of making a border around it. That will also not make the person understand how to use the concept. It will become empty, and this emptiness is what we call the psyche, the lack of understanding, the lack of depth, the superficiality of modern world. So that's why I think it's unfortunate that poor Venerable Augustine is taking the role of the strawman here. But of course, no bad will is intended by Wittgenstein. He is also attacking another person even more venomously, and that is his former self, the younger Ludwig Wittgenstein. Maybe Kalle, you would like to have a little comment here? I'll put it on you.
Yes. I was thinking about what a professor at Örebro University here in Sweden said, who wanted to show that etymology is not important. He gave an example of the word grönsak, vegetable in English, that it's all completely arbitrary, it doesn't have any meaning. We shouldn't care about etymology. And then I thought about Mackley-Christ, who gave an example why one case where etymology is important. The word understand. It comes from the word. It's not related. Here we have a false friend. It doesn't have to do with under, but it has to do with between. So something understand is something between something, standing between, and between is a key word for many things. The meanings are often between. To understand is to grasp the things which are between. That is the difference in Derrida's term. To understand is to be between, to understand the things that are between, and the between is another word for the Derridian difference. And you, speaking of Augustine, who is here pointing his finger, he has there one. You could think about the number 1, for instance, and you pointed out very clearly last time, Hans, that we should avoid using too much the word 1. We should instead use ordinary numbers like first, 2, because then you understand that it's about numbering. So numbers are not out there platonically, but you need actually fingers or something else to count them. So this text by von Johnston is very important. And this quotation from page 19 is a good, is a very good quotation. And so the point here is that naming is the culmination of previous processes that we forget. Namely that we, in order to have number 5, for instance, we have to first count to number 5. now I could ask you something concretely. What do you think about this teacher who says that the word, the etymology of the word grönsak doesn't matter? I give it back to you if you want to answer. Grön means green, of course.
Yes, as you mentioned, Jacques Derrida, he invents a specific word called iteration, whereas that takes in the difference and also the whole stage that is behind the iteration. The context, the history, the etymology, all the doings in the world that sort of give fleshes out the concept. And to say that the etymology of a vegetable is not interesting is so untrue. I don't know. It is extraordinarily important. I came to think only about the case of China and the Chinese science. There the etymology is built into the science. So everyone can see the development historically of the sign, in the sign, and usually much more than that, which participate clearly in vision, in spoken language, in hearing, and you can see the complexities there. They are enormous. And of course a thing like a vegetable has a big complexity going on. It is not just pointing and say vegetable and then you understood it. I didn't understand vegetable, it took me years and being young. Doesn't happen in a second. I think until the age of 8 I didn't think there was a difference between fruits and vegetables. Of course I know an apple was a fruit and tomato was a vegetable, but I couldn't tell. That took time. And time disappears here, and so does the depth of understanding. The most important iteration that makes words of fleshy, meaningful nature, not superficial as this teacher. I think, well, maybe that was just an exception, but could point to that the whole teacher doesn't understand the things he or she is using. It's against understanding itself. I think we round up there and say thank you very much for your comment, and thank you for listening to this patiently taking lectures. But there is a gem here in the writings of Paul Johnston that can be brought to all areas. This is not the area of philosophy, as Wittgenstein would say. This is everything. Everything that has ever been done and said. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.
Thank you.